Take it away, Annie.
Okay, looks like we are live and I can't close that out. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Elfrith, Senator from District 30 and co-chair of the Joint Committee on Program Open Space and Agricultural Land Preservation, joined by Delegate Robin Lewis, co-chair from the House. This is our second meeting of 2024. We're taking a bit of a deeper dive into some nuanced policy issues that touch the Joint Committee's purview, but are a little more relevant to some of the work this legislature has done over the past few years. So we're covering everything from sustainable agriculture to our food systems to public water access, state parks, things that Marylanders certainly care about, and we want to make sure we hear from our agencies and departments on their plans, not just in response to the General Assembly's legislation, but also what the exciting things they're working on now. So we are joined by Department of Agriculture, Department of Natural Resources, Department of Planning, and the Maryland Food Systems Resiliency Council. We are going to go in that order, and I do know that Secretary Addix has a hard stop at 2:20, so we are prioritizing Department of Agriculture. Delegate Lewis was kind enough to let me go first. This is my last meeting as not just my last meeting as co-chair of this joint committee. I think it's the last meeting I'll be chairing in this capacity. So bittersweet, but very, very proud of the work that this joint committee has been able to achieve with all of its members who are passionate about these subject areas that we're going to discuss today. So with that, Chair Lewis, if it's okay, we'll kick it over to the Secretary.
Sounds great. Thank you, Senator.
Mr. Secretary.
Thank you very much. And first, if I could thank the Senator for all of her leadership, not just her work on this, but her leadership on land management, the environment, the Bay. We celebrated a major achievement yesterday with the Bay program, signing a continuance of their work. And what I love most about having Governors Shapiro and Moore and then I've blanked on the Virginia governor's name.
Governor Youngkin.
Thank you, Youngkin, as it just pulled up on my screen. The speeches they gave could quite literally have been given by any of those governors. So the kind of unanimity of the voice is a testament to the Bay Commission and the work that we've done. So very, very happy to be continuing that. And Senator, we look forward to working with you. Members of this joint subcommittee, Kevin Addix, Secretary of Agriculture. We can move to that next slide. First thing I will preview is a new program which was announced to be part of the governor's legislative package, the Bay Forward Bill, and that is the new LEAF program, the Leaders in Environmentally Engaged Farming. And think of the LEAF program as an umbrella program, a voluntary program, but a program that allows us to use all of the tools that we have, all of the tools that our nonprofit partners have, all of the levers that exist for us to be able to leverage the conservation practices we need in the places that we need them. So it is, to the Senator's favorite word, our effort to target, our effort to aim the practices where we believe they're most needed, not to cut them off for other folks, but through creating a system that relies on a point system, much like the LEED building code standard. And I keep saying this in groups, but with LEED, you don't need to build a green building, but if you do, there are standards that have been developed, points that have been assigned to those practices, and then someone who's building a building decides which they want to move forward with, and they earn a LEED score. LEAF is the same concept. But in addition to the practices that we have on the ground already, in addition to the practices related to the environment that we plan as well, we're expanding how we're looking at this to community practices as well. So if a farmer is growing food, there may be points for that, food over feed. If a farmer is growing perennial over annual, there may be points for that. If a farmer is engaging in work with the food bank, engaging in agricultural education, engaging in agritourism, which we know is a primary means of agricultural education, there may be points assigned to that. And so your score will be not just because of how you treat the land. Your score also incorporates how you engage with the community. So we can jump to the next slide. Our goal will be to target the largest reductions possible. So when you think about it, planting a riparian buffer is a good idea, but it's probably more important on the Eastern Shore than it might be in Northern Frederick County. And so it would allow us the ability, whereas right now a practice is a practice is a practice. Now, under this program, we will be able to prioritize where these are going to go. And if you're putting a riparian buffer on the Eastern Shore in a critical area, maybe you're assigned more points. Our goal is to take what we know from the Caesar report and spin this into, this is our version of sandboxing, is to engage with local universities, give farmers essentially points for engaging in research, because we're hearing a lot of great ideas. As we're talking about this program, we have new ideas coming at us just about every day. Can we get points for this? What if we try this? So the other thing we're trying to do is to create a recognizable brand that a farmer will have a leaf score. What are some of the incentives? There will be some money behind it for some new incentives. For some new practices. We also look to continue with all of our existing practices and the funds that come to it through the Maryland Ag Conservation Grants and cover crop, et cetera. And those will all have points assigned to it. But we're also looking to leverage the private sector money and the nonprofit sector money where they're already engaging with farmers and they're looking for new folks with whom to try new practices and or roll out practices that their research with their university partners has shown to work. So we're very excited about being able to assign points for that. So we can jump to the next slide. So keeping this in mind, that every farmer is within 2.5 hours of 2 to 3 major metropolitan areas, that's our top kind of consciousness in our Department of Ag. And secondly is we farm in the context of the Bay. The first one turns into needing to be about opportunities for farmers to meet the demand of this incredible population that lives here. Now, that incredible population has impacts on farmers. It creates development pressure, which we have to manage. It also creates environmental pressure. So keeping that second point in mind is right there at the top of our list. Next slide, please. But it gets into value-added agriculture, the idea that our farmers need opportunities to scale up, diversify, and create products that they can sell directly to the millions of people that we have that other states and other farmers don't necessarily have within reach. They're willing to come to our farms to buy things. They're willing to go to a store and buy something local. Dialogue between state agencies has been a top priority. We've hired our value-added specialist, Martin, who is in the other room, able to take questions. He's been training up. First of all, he created a regulatory analysis of all of the challenges, all of the pitfalls that are causing farmers to maybe not move forward with value-added ag. And again, value-added ag would be corn into popcorn, grapes into jelly, et cetera, creating a product that is much more valuable and much more marketable than a bushel of corn, than a bunch of grapes. So Martin created an analysis of what are our hurdles. That came out in June. And then a little bit later, Martin began meeting with and training county officials who very often are the first ones who hear from a farmer that they'd like to level up and try something new. But the county officials, whether they're in economic development or sometimes in tourism or sometimes on the county council, et cetera, may not know who in the different agencies to recommend the farmer reaches out to. So Martin's trying to become that person, the clearinghouse that everybody can point to. Go to Martin, go to MDA, and then from there we will begin pointing people in the right direction. GICA, our governor's interagency committee on agriculture, began meeting in earnest this December, this month. We had an organizational meeting earlier this year, but what that is, it is a commission of all of the relevant agencies that have touch points with agriculture who come together in our building to have discussions about these challenges and how to overcome these challenges. So it's not an external lobbying group trying to do it. It's not necessarily me or Martin trying to do it. It's a teamwork approach where we're bringing in planning and commerce and health and environment. And here's the challenge. Here's what we had to overcome. Can we be creative? Do we need to change regs? That's where that happens, and it's been very successful so far. Next slide. I mentioned the gathering of local ag and economic development professionals. That's been really, really strong. I will say in terms of the needs and the trends, we need more scaled processing. We need more meat processing. We need more cooperative dairy processing so that we can have, someone of scale who's making cheese or processing animals and processing meat, so that the industry can stop sending all of their products and their animals to Pennsylvania and Virginia to be processed. We need to do that here. Requests just specifically for our meat and poultry technical assistance is up. So we're getting many, many more interested parties. Martin hosted a great day where we had someone from a think tank and also a funding arm come in and talk about how we can get more people licensed. Next slide. Last thing on value-added ag. So Martin is working toward, I mentioned, being that navigator. It's going to be really important going forward to make sure that we've got every kind of tool ready and available. He's starting an online video series where we're going to have something that's standing there, so we don't need to have 3 or 4 seminars a year. We probably still will, but we can point people to these online resources. Hey, you want to do XYZ, go here and learn how to do it, and we'll have a running list of the resources, keeping updated there. We can go to the next slide. On to our certified local farm and fish program. This was established in 2020, enhanced this last year to include invasive blue catfish. But the goal here is to encourage state agencies and public four-year universities to achieve an overall goal of purchasing 20% of their food from certified local farms. We currently have 135 agriculture and invasive species providers, which doesn't sound very attractive, but catfish providers in the directory. And we just held a meeting this last week where we brought together MSDE, a major purchaser of local food and a potentially exponentially bigger purchaser of local food, and also DGS, Department of General Services, to talk with our farmers about not just getting through our certified local program. That's easy to become certified. But then how do you actually register and go through the state procurement process, market and promote your products, and get moving? And that was a very successful meeting. We got high marks for that. And a big thank you to DGS for helping to explain our sometimes red tapey procurement process. Next slide. I just mentioned that, got ahead of myself. And then there's the Marbitco CLFF aggregation grant program, which has been very, very successful since its inception. There have been 18 applications, approved applicants, roughly $1.5 million out the door to build aggregation programs. In other words, this is so that if MSDE says, hey, let's pick Frederick. Frederick County needs a whole bunch of green beans. There can be an aggregator who can say, great, I'll get you the green beans. Am I good? You still hear me? Okay, so you can have all the green beans together and actually get it aggregated. So very excited about that. There are 5 pending projects, roughly $700,000 to go out the door. And the Marbitco has been matching grants. It's been very good. And I see we got their acronym wrong there. So we need a C between the D and the O. That was my glitch there. Next slide, please. Statewide food insecurity map. So I know we've got Nancy Nunn, who chairs our Food System Resiliency Council. That has been an incredibly effective group at number one, making everybody aware of the challenges we have to the larger food system. But more than that, finding solutions and making concrete recommendations. One of them is the statewide food insecurity map, to actually create a visualization of where we have food insecurity. That's being worked on now, but what I can tell you about is through the discussions. I know everybody thinks that it's Baltimore City that's food insecure, but guess what? It's every jurisdiction, and it's rural areas, and it's suburban areas, and yes, the urban areas. But the food insecurity takes different images and different representations where you are in the state. That will be an incredible asset once we have that. And when we get to Q&A, perhaps there can be more discussion about that. Next slide. Very excited about this stat. Next slide. When we're talking about preservation, total number of easements is 2,800 easements, a total acreage of 376,500 acres that are preserved under our program alone, and that's not all the other programs. And then MALF, we're very excited last week. Michelle Cable, our executive director, was in our office and she said, we surpassed the billion-dollar mark in state money used to preserve land. That is a huge commitment that other states are looking at and are excited by our progress. And we're seeing competition between counties who are recommending land to be preserved, all in this effort to preserve as much as we can, because development pressure is increasing exponentially over the last number of years. So very excited about those metrics. Michelle is inundated with requests. There is never enough money. There is never enough staff to get it done. But we're doing a really good job just seeing that we've hit this $1 billion mark. Next slide. Interest from farm owners remains extremely high, and that is despite threats, despite increased value that they're receiving, despite offers that they're receiving from solar companies to put solar on their farms. A lot of farmers are still choosing to preserve their farms, and that is a very important thing to note. We've heard that we might be running out of land to preserve in certain jurisdictions. There is plenty of land still to preserve, and we're excited about the prospects for this program and other land preservation programs. Next. We've got to keep funding. We've got to make sure that we keep our eye on preserving. Secretary Kurtz has mentioned that 30 by 30, we did it. 40 by 40, it's going to be really difficult. If we make it to 50 and there's another 50 that we're trying to get, it's going to get exponentially more difficult because of the fact that our population is growing and our population needs more space. Our counties need more infrastructure. And so it's just going to get more expensive and more challenging as we go through. Next slide. I think we're good here. I think we did that. Next. I think we're good.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Do you have a minute for questions or a
I
hard
do.
stop at 2:20?
I do.
Okay, I'll open it up to the committee. For questions, you can use your raise hand feature or politely jump in.
I'll politely jump in the interest of time. Thank you, Senator. Thank you so much, Secretary Addix. Great overview. Really thrilled to see that $1 billion threshold surpassed. I think that's a credit to the agency and all of the folks who are working, as well as to the farmers who are interested in preserving land. My question for you, you mentioned that 40 by 40 goal again. Glad you brought us back to that. We want to preserve agricultural lands, but we also want to welcome economic development. We want to, the governor and many of us have committed to housing investment.
Yep.
And so how do we do both? Is there a thread the needle on that? Can you talk about that quickly?
Well, we've got our genie of planning on here in Secretary Flora, and she will surely go over that. But look, it's not a compromise. We're actually able to do all of those things, but it takes sustainable growth. It takes thinking a little more deeply about where we're going to develop and how we're going to develop. Just like farmers are thinking deeply about whether or not they're going to diversify and how the market's changing and how the weather's changing. It's certainly all doable. It's just a matter of where the priorities reside. Look, preservation, just like development, it's optional. It's voluntary. So if you're a farmer and you would like to sell your land for development, or you would like to lease your land for solar, that's on you, and you're able to do that, and that's your decision. No one's telling you which way to go. If you'd like to preserve your land and keep on that legacy tradition of agriculture, which is something that we hear a lot from farmers who come in wanting to preserve, is that they want to make sure that that land continues on in that fourth, fifth, sixth generation, sometimes more than that, of farming. So, and that's not to say that New and interesting and innovative things can't happen on that farm, and that's by no means to say that that farm won't be surrounded by development. We know that all of those pressures exist. I've heard a number of farmers, once they get into the value-added agriculture space and they see that local farm sell to development, they say, well, there's my next customer base, right? So it's very interesting how these two can coexist.
Thank you. We'll keep thinking about that. Thank you,
Thank
Senator.
you.
Yep.
Thank you, Secretary.
Senator Brooks.
Okay, thanks, Madam Co-Chair, and thanks for the presentation, Senator. I'm a Secretary Addicts. I'm gonna give you a promotion here.
So no promotions. Come on.
Okay, yeah. The example you use about the making jam out of fruit, milk. I mean cheese out of milk, and then and organic products, and I always think about the pros and the cons. And the pros would be like increased revenue, diversification, and the other part of that, I think too, that doing value added ag, that there would be somewhat of a startup cost to get to that particular process. And I'm looking to see whether or not there will be increased risk involved there, just to make sure that there's a market. And then of course the storage, and then and what about the part about making sure that the proper certification is had,
Sure.
actually with the storage and whatnot of foods. So could you speak a little bit about those perhaps challenges?
Sure. You mentioned all the challenges. The other challenge would be trying to get financing if you don't have the money, which is yet another challenge. One of the reasons we have a value-added specialist is to assist with all of those. So when a farmer decides they would like to diversify and try a value-added process, many of them go out on their own, they get it done, it's great. Some of them, the smaller ones, the newer ones, those from underserved, underrepresented communities, very often need a navigator, and that's what Martin has become. And we've seen email after phone call from folks who have been essentially onboarded and directed by our team to the right licensing, because you can get into the wrong licensing scheme and realize at the end of it that you picked the wrong one and you actually can't do what you need to do. So that, it's one of the reasons we have this governor's interagency commission, is to help make it easier for someone to get their way through this process, so that you don't need to hire attorneys and land use attorneys and permitting and licensing attorneys, that it shouldn't be that difficult. And our goal is to lower those bars and thresholds so that people can get it done.
All right, thank you, sir.
And I will need to jump off, so my team is sitting there ready to answer any further questions, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Seeing no further questions, I appreciate all the work that you're doing and excited to see your legislative agenda soon. Perfect.
It's coming. Thank you.
Okay. Delegate Lewis, I'll kick it back to you for DNR.
Happy to take up the baton, Senator. Next on our agenda is the Department of Natural Resources. We're going to hear about Chesapeake Bay Agreement with for the public water access goal status, Gwynns Falls State Park Partnership Park status, and the Next Generation Adaptation Plan, status update on that, as well as the Maryland Land Preservation and Recreation Plan. We will hear from the Honorable Joshua Kurtz. Secretary Kurtz, take it away.
Great, thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to start with the Bay Agreement water access. Always good to start with good news. We have successfully met the outcome that was laid forth in the 2014 agreement. I think this is a space where it was really invigorating yesterday to hear the three governors of Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Maryland all specifically talk about the importance of outdoor recreation when it comes to the Bay restoration. At the end of the day, we're restoring the Bay for all of the inhabitants of the watershed, and people being a primary reason for that. So we have met that. We have some stats up here in Maryland about our water access. Now, while we're saying, yes, we've been successful in meeting the goal we laid out as a partnership, I think we all recognize that there is still not enough public water access in our communities across the Bay, and that is not equitably distributed. And I think that's one thing that jumps out when you look at the map. As you zoom in, you realize there are large swaths of the coast that are not open for public access. And so that's something that we're working on, whether that be through looking at acquisition opportunities, whether that be looking at opportunities for partnerships with entities that own public land or own land that's currently private, but that can be opened up. This is a really important thing for us here in Maryland. We were just looking at the outdoor recreation economic data. We've seen a massive increase from 8 billion to 12 billion in terms of economic output from the outdoor recreation community and industry. And so this is an area we see as really ripe for amendment in the Bay Agreement, and possibly thinking about this a little bit differently, kind of qualitatively. It's not just water access, but it's specific types of water access, specific proximity to water access. There's many things that are being discussed now within the context of the Bay Agreement. If we can go to the next slide, please. So yeah, I kind of got ahead of myself a little bit here, but there are challenges here. Obviously, many of the sites that we manage for this were developed in the 90s, and those facilities are starting to degrade. So a lot of O&M is going into these spaces right now. We have a lot of peers that don't necessarily meet with the larger boats, right? And so thinking about the change in the boating community is also something that we're looking at. We're also really looking, and our Office of Outdoor Rec is leading on this in partnership with our Chesapeake Coastal Services unit. We're really closing that data gap, better understanding of where we have local opportunities, where we have private companies that are allowing for public access. And I think one of the really exciting developments this past year was the creation of the Water Trail in Baltimore City, which really ties together public and private access points, and I think is a really good model for some of the ways that we can think about access more generally across the Bay. Next slide, please. And so moving, actually, it's a good thing I was talking about Baltimore, so we'll stay in Baltimore now for the Gwynn Falls State Park, or Partnership Park update. So I just want to give you all an idea of where we are in process. We've had a couple meetings with high-level leadership in the mayor's office, Baltimore City Parks and Rec, DNR, and we've put together a wide range of different components for our planning. One is we've created a stakeholder advisory committee. Those members have, many of them volunteered, reached out, requested to be a part of it. So we collected feedback on who those stakeholders should be. We wanted to have a really broad, both geographic and also community focus around the park in terms of who makes up that stakeholder group, as well as a really broad group of users. So making sure that we're really hearing from a diverse number of individuals on what they would like to see and need to see out of a potential partnership park there. We will now be stepping into a larger stakeholder using that. So we'll have a larger stakeholder advisory committee, and then we will step into a set of focus groups. Those are going to be based around the different components of the bill for what we want to see in the development of that park, where we should be prioritizing, what our infrastructure needs are, safety. Public safety has been a big concern. So really, we are going to have a separate focus group for that. And so those will be distributed around the park in Baltimore City to really help us get an understanding of some of the opportunities and challenges that exist in the park. And really, I wanted to start with kind of where we are in the process, because I think it really informs the questions around connectivity to other parks. We are going to build out those opportunities for connectivity to the system in there through this public process. And so what we'll learn through this process is where there are opportunities to better integrate with Baltimore City Parks and Rec, better integrate in some of their facilities, opportunities potentially for us to think about acquisition in other places. It is a priority of ours to ensure that all of our jurisdictions have a state park. Obviously, Baltimore City does not, Wycomico County as well. And so that's a priority for us to ensure that we have that across the state. Next slide, please. And now I'll turn to the next gen plan. This has been a large body of work across several state agencies that we're really excited about. And really the thing that's so critical with resilience is taking that long-term view. And one of the, I think, strengths of this plan is that it is that 10-year roadmap. And it really looked at where we can increase resiliency across a wide range of topical areas. And I think really excited for, and I know Mike Hinson's going to be on later, but the creation and the Chief Resilience Office and having the Chief Resilience Officer, we really appreciate the participation from them and kind of the finalizing of this. There's several different elements to this plan that cut across many, many agencies. We have 3 focus groups: justice, equity, diversion, and inclusion, local government and state service delivery, and climate jobs and training. So a really broad space in terms of looking at resilience. If you go to the next slide, please. And so I wanted to talk about the resiliency planning that we're doing at the state level. And it is incorporated in that resilience plan in a few sectors: the natural resources and ecosystems, working lands, and human health. I think the human health one is one that's, I think, really important for us. Also as a communications tool about the importance of our state lands for having a healthy population, and how important from a societal resilience perspective, having those areas for community gathering and building cohesiveness. And so we have been working on this now for a few years. We have our own resilient systems officer who has been out touring parks, working with them on building out plans. We've completed resilience plans for Pocomoke State Forest, Assateague State Park, Browns Branch, Chesapeake Forest Lands. And so really what we're doing is we're starting with what are the places and what are the state places or lands that we own that are most vulnerable? And then what resilience plans do we have in place for that? And we're really excited. We had $5 million allocated under the Great Maryland Outdoors Act for climate-related projects. We have those dollars are either planned for, in the process of being spent, or encumbered. And so I think one of the areas that we looked at was Point Lookout in the southern part of Maryland, a significant cultural resource, incredible place for water access, really checks all the boxes. Also an area that is experiencing really high degree of impacts from changing climate, whether that be increased water coming down the Potomac, as well as increased storm surge, higher winds, higher precipitation. And that's having a real detrimental impact on the fort that's there, which is a Civil War era fort. So there's a lot of challenges. And so we've actually built a resilience plan that we are funding through some of the funds from that Great Maryland Outdoors Act money. So we're very excited about that. Also will help us educate other landowners about what they could do, projects they could do on their lands to make their properties more resilient in the face of a changing climate. Next slide, please. And the last thing we have to update you on is our land preservation and recreation plan status. And so what we did here is we wanted to align our comprehensive long-term strategic plan for the park system with our land preservation and recreation plan. And really what we want to do is align all of our long-term planning projects around managing our lands, around acquiring new lands, and around our operation of all of those lands. So thinking about them kind of cohesively or holistically, not just our parks as our parks, our forests as our forests, et cetera. And so what we've done is aligned those two from a timeline perspective, which allows us then to go out and to procure this through a single contractor. And this contractor has a lot of experience working on these types of things across the country. And one of the things they're really well known for is their engagement with the public. And that was very important for us because at the end of the day, all of these are public resources. We want these to be well used and we want these to be sustainable. And we're really excited. The contractor is going to be going live shortly with a survey to Maryland residents. That's going to really help us inform both of these plans and both of these plans holistically. So very excited about this ability to align these two together and very much appreciate the support of the General Assembly and both the House and the Senate in a previous bill we had last session. So I believe that is my last slide. Yes, thank you. I'm happy to take any questions if you want me to now, or if we're going to wait till the end, happy to do that too.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I see no hands, so let me ask if you are able to share with us any relevant pieces of legislation that you would be putting forward in January related to anything you just discussed, or land preservation generally.
Yeah. So we are working on a piece of legislation right now that really seeks to kind of ensure that not only do we have the sustainability long-term in our acquisition dollars, but also gives us more sustainability in our operations. And one of the things that came out of Great Maryland Outdoors Act, as you know very well, was the DLS report. And it really looked at how we ensure that we are properly resourcing from an operations perspective our state lands. And so we're working on a piece of legislation that would allow us to do that. So those two are really, I think, those two components would be critical for us when we think about long-term land protection, long-term resiliency, and getting greater access for Marylanders to our public waterways. And would be happy to come back and give you all a much deeper briefing on that before session.
Yes, Delegate Lewis.
Thank you, Senator. Thanks again, Secretary Kurtz. All of our secretaries are really good at covering a mass of material really quickly and comprehensively. Thank you as well for your overview. I'm so encouraged to hear about progress with the Gwynns Falls Partnership Park. And I just want to say thank you to your team. And I want to give kudos to the Office of Mayor Scott and the Baltimore City Recreation and Parks Department. I know you guys are all working together to lay the foundation for, the establishment of a great partnership. And I know there will always be tension between local and state authority over public goods like these parks. I look forward to seeing Baltimore learn from other jurisdictions some best practices for establishing a partnership park, working out all the kinks and running it. I know we have a lot to build on. I thank everyone for that. One thing I just want to make sure about, I'm always going to come back to this. Last meeting, Director Flora shared with me some information about the value of parks on the economy. And as I recall, something like a $1 investment in parks generates, depending on the state, if a $1 investment in land conservation or parks could generate between $4 and $11 in return. So there's a powerful economic incentive to establishing the Lincoln Falls Park and doing it really well. Mm-hmm. Will the opportunity for value capture, establishing revenues to run the future partnership park in a way that's sustainable, as you refer to yourself, is that a subject on the agenda as you move forward?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think one of the key pieces of any of these partnership parks is being innovative when we think about the economic impact that it can have. And I think one thing we've been working to really clarify in the department is how we capture indirect economic opportunity. And so an example of that I'll use Rocky Gap as an example because we were just talking about this. But we looked at, okay, we have a state park there, and that state park needs to have somebody who can serve food. That state park is going to have somebody who is going to manage the kayaks and lead trips. And we're looking around and we're going, okay, we could do that in-house, or we could look into the surrounding community. And Cumberland is close to Rocky Gap, and so we've entered into partnerships with a local recreational outfit there, Wheels Up. They're managing our kayak rentals. They're leading rock climbing. Queen City Creamery, if you're familiar with Cumberland, I'm sure you've been to Queen City Creamery. It's incredible.
I haven't. My life is unfulfilled. I will put that on my list.
Well, if you can't get all the way to Cumberland, we have Queen City Creamery as our concessionaire at Rocky Gap. So you could stop 15 minutes before Queen City Creamery, get us some ice cream, and then go to Queen City Creamery and have a milkshake. So, that's something that we're really trying to be cognizant of, is how we can provide greater opportunity for local businesses. To also tap into, to your point, the magnification or the amplification of expenditures there. So that's something that will be a part of that discussion, and it's something that's really core for us when we look at all of our facilities. Because I think there are a lot of really innovative models, and that piece of legislation I was kind of alluding to before, we're looking at a statutory authority for us to have a foundation. And that's something that has been extremely successful at the national parks, the National Park Foundation, in terms of really helping drive greater engagement with local communities, greater economic input and output for local communities, as well as funding long-term and sustainably operations. And I could really foresee an opportunity in Gwynn Falls and across the entirety of our park service for that to play an important role for us from a financial perspective and really from a community engagement perspective.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you, Senator. Back to you.
All very exciting stuff. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Any other questions for our friends at DNR? Senator Brooks.
Yes, thanks, Senator. Secretary Curtis, initially there was a slide showing that the Bay Agreement water access and the outcome by 2025 to add 300 new public access sites with strong emphasis on providing opportunities for boating, swimming, and fishing. Is that a goal, or is that something that will be achieved? At what level are you in achieving that, if you haven't thus far?
Yep. So that goal for the 300 new, and that's a really good point, Senator. They are new water access points. That is not just Maryland. That is across the entirety of the agreement of the watershed. And we have achieved that goal across that watershed, across the entirety of the watershed. But again, I think we still have ample opportunity to improve our water access for our constituents here in Maryland.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Thanks very much.
Mr. Secretary, could you dig into that? So just so we have an understanding of the correct data points here, what the bullets you have at the bottom, the 500 water access points, that's currently where we're sitting.
Correct.
But where do we come from?
Ooh, I can follow up. It would depend on the year. I guess we could go back to 2014 and look at, we can send you data on that between the beginning of the agreement and now for Maryland, because we are reporting that out. We'll follow up with the committee on that with the Maryland specific details.
Okay. And then what's next?
Yep. And I think what's next in the Bay Agreement and I think was touched on in the meeting yesterday is really reevaluating this. And I believe that it's not just about access points, right? Saying that maybe the next goal is 300 more, but there needs to be that kind of qualitative focus to ensure that we're putting them equitably across the watershed, and that we're ensuring that you're getting a wide range of different types of access, right? A concrete boat ramp is not the same thing as an ADA compliant kayak launch, is not the same thing as a soft launch where people can swim from, et cetera. And so I think it's also, we've been working on this at our Office of Outdoor Recreation, is really understanding what each one of those assets actually represents in Maryland, and then ensuring that we have that adequate opportunities for all of the multiple types of water access that we're discussing.
I greatly appreciate that. When do you, I don't mean to put pressure right before session, but when do you think that the next iteration of this plan would be ready for this joint committee to consider?
Yeah, and so that will be built out over the next year at the Bay Agreement level. And then from there, we'll take that and then downscale that here into Maryland for the part of that we will still be working to meet. But we have other goals as it relates to outdoor recreation we can share with you that are a little bit separate from the agreement. But those two are the two different spaces in which we're doing this planning.
Perfect. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, seeing no other questions, thank you very much to
I have a question.
Oh, sorry, Delegate Baker, please jump in.
Yeah, when you talk about DNR sites, like here in Washington County, I know our county is often creating new sites along our creeks and bodies of water within our county. Are those numbers included in with your numbers?
Sandy, we're capturing local, yes, we're capturing local parks, state parks. It's any public access. I think the one we're still working to refine is private businesses that also allow access. Obviously, we have marinas and things like that, but there are companies and across I think about like a Domino Sugar, right? In Baltimore City, they have a public oyster gardening space, which is a public access point. So we're trying to also bring in more of the private companies and private lands that also allow access as well.
Yeah, we're capturing fishing, swimming, and boating sites.
Local government access points are included in your numbers.
Yes.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Delegate. Great clarifying question. Okay, I think with that, DNR, we appreciate you're more than welcome to stay if you would like. Next, we have the Department of Planning, where we will hear a deeper dive into our goals as a state to conserve 40% of land and possible legislation the General Assembly may see in January related to that goal. And we are joined by Secretary Flora. Welcome, Madam Secretary.
Great. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Good to see you all again. Thank you for having me. Yeah, we're going to talk about the other side of the equation. You know, there's the whole, how do we conserve? How do we take care of all of these wonderful lands that we all love and enjoy here in Maryland? But to do that, we have to really think about growth policy. So if you go to the next slide. Whoever's controlling. So you had two specific discussion topics that you asked us about. So I'm going to touch on those, but do those by framing how we are thinking about sustainable growth. So let's just go ahead to the next slide. And basically, sustainable growth policy in Maryland, some of you may be well aware of, has really first became known in 1992, and it was very much conservation policy. That's evolved over 30 years from what started out as 7 what were called visions. They grew one more in 2000 and then all the way up to 12 in 2009, but no one's really looked at them since then. And so what we are going to be submitting is an amendment to growth policy legislation. So this is an amendment to current land use policy and under the state finance and procurement. And I'll explain to you a little bit what we're doing. But in terms of our moving from smart to sustainable growth, we've had a lot of success thinking about how do we preserve and protect. In fact, there's been nearly 1,900 acres as of September of 24 preserved through various programs and whatnot. But what's become apparent is that we really didn't spend as much focus on, well, what's going on inside of those areas that we are developing? How are we developing them? Who has access to those areas? And that's where we're refocusing by moving from this topic of smart growth, which there was legislation amendment last session around moving from smart to sustainable as it relates to our subcabinet. So going into the 2025 session, we're actually also updating the land use and finance and procurement codes as it relates to smart to sustainable. One of the reasons we're doing that is to create more of this balance in terms of, well, what does sustainable growth mean? And that is that balance between economic, social, and environmental implications. Whereas in the past, we were really very much focused on the conservation side of the equation. Next slide. But in order for the conservation side to work, we really have to think about, well, how do we make communities thrive? And how do we develop in a way, how do we grow in a way so what's sort of inside the donut, so to speak, is thriving and successful, and that those communities are being, and lands are being optimized in terms of those development areas. Next slide. And so this is a question, the thriving communities question is an important one that I just kind of skipped through, but what does that mean to different people? And how do we help shape those types of communities? So we see the potential in the future through this amendment to reframe growth policy as one around this balance of sustainable growth. And we can build on the foundation and the success of the smart growth policy that was all about where we build. We can add more guidance in terms of, well, how do we do that well? That it is possible to grow our economy and protect our environment and our ecological systems. But we have to really think about what does sustainable growth look like. Some of my past was as a developer, and it was doing sustainable development projects. I know full well that it is doable, but we have to put more focus on that notion of how. And then, of course, who. Are we basically pricing out people in some of these development areas because only the wealthy can afford to live there because we've sort of developed them in a way where it doesn't create opportunities for all? So those are questions we have to address and how we think about growth policy moving forward, and just creating overall better consistency across how we use growth policy across the state. And so that's where we're moving forward in the Department of Planning, is to really clean up in some respects, expand, bring up to date how we think about growth policy, and create this common framework. And I'll touch on that because right now there's a lot of confusion because you have on the ground local policy as it relates to zoning and comprehensive plan, you have state policies. And so when you have a lot of confusion, there is no unifying framework. People don't know what they can do where, and they tend to go, particularly developers, the path of least resistance. And often that's places we don't always want development to happen. Next slide. So as we sort of look at this going, well, we are looking at this going forward, we are bringing this amendment to you. I'll obviously be giving you more detail on that as we move forward, but I wanted to at least share with you the fact that that is something we're going to be doing and why we're doing it. Next slide. One of the things that on the why we're doing it is just to create more relevance. The previous visions that were on the books were very vague. They weren't necessarily apples to apples. And when you have things that people don't know what they are, then they typically don't use them. So we haven't really had, I don't think, the most robust use of our policy to date. Create more clarity in terms of the general public really understanding what it is this is, better alignment, and just simplicity across the system rather than more complexity. We want to simplify. Next slide. So the key updates you're going to be seeing is around just the name change. We're going from visions rather than having 12 big audacious vision statements, very focused, clear 8 planning principles around which we can align and create a framework for what is sustainable growth in Maryland. And those 8 principles are around land, transportation, economy, housing, place, equity, resilience, and ecology, the core areas that we need to focus on to create this balance of sustainable growth. Next slide. So what does that get for us in terms of the 40 by 40? Getting to 40 by 40 is going to be extremely hard if we don't focus on growth policy and if we don't figure out a way to make growth doable, reachable, accessible, and sustainable, and that it's really balancing the needs of our ecology, of human health issues, creating a sense of place, and how do we make that easier? We think through creating, first of all, this framework and alignment and a set of metrics that go with that. To date, the only metric we've really utilized is the priority funding area metric. We have actually are in the process of standing up technical advisory groups around each of these 8 principles using a cross-agency and interagency approach where we can actually better frame and define and work across the agencies of what does this mean and how do we all begin to use it. And we're going to be developing that in parallel as a guidance document with the legislative process that'll be moving forward. If we can take, for instance, a Grayfield, an old shopping center site. We know retail has changed dramatically. We have sites that are old shopping center sites or even just surface parking lots that are serious underutilization of developable land. We need to think about the developable land we have and be able to find ways to optimize it, whether that be through the TOD type processes that we're doing through MDOT and DHCD and some of the housing legislation from last session, but really looking across that landscape of developable land, places where we should be developing, places where there are existing infrastructure, places where there is, in some cases, transit, in other cases, even in rural areas, to the extent that we can have more concentrated population centers, it allows us to provide better services to those areas also because they're not so scattered out everywhere. It also helps us in terms of fiscal resources, rather than building new and longer pipes and roads, maintaining what we have, optimizing the land around those areas in a better, higher performing manner. And that's the whole intent, that if we do that, there'll be less incentive to sprawl out and develop on areas where we don't want people necessarily to develop, because that will infringe on some of our 40 by 40 goals and where we're trying to get with those. Next slide. You also had asked, so there's so much packed in there. And I would, I have a huge presentation that I've done for other groups and internally and with other agencies. I just did a presentation to MACO with very specifics to walk them through in terms of their planning directors, piece by piece, each of those 8 principles. It's a little like what Secretary Addix and Department of Agriculture is doing with their LEAF program. This will also be somewhat structurally like the Lead for Building Systems program, which I actually helped write 20 years ago when I was with U.S. Green Building Council, but it's a way of creating a framework that is approachable and people can use. A lot more, like I said, that I'd be happy to share with you about that. But to get us to a point where land use policy is about sustainable growth and actually makes it easier to grow where we should be growing. As it relates to the housing development permits, which you had all asked, understanding housing development permits is one part of the equation. As I mentioned earlier, we want to make it easier for people to develop where they should be developing. So understanding better, and this particular piece of legislation was focused on communities of 150,000 or more. And I think it gets us partway there, but to the extent that we can understand permitting processes, where there's impediments, where there are barriers, both at the state and local level, that are really keeping us from essentially guiding development to where it's best positioned to succeed. And part of that is housing, but it's really a whole array of development. Even mixed use isn't allowed in some places where we should be embracing mixed use, where we can create more walkability and access to a variety of services and, you know, residents close to where they work, and a whole variety, and even community services. If we can create these thriving communities, those things are all interconnected and work better to get us to where we want to be on the 40 by 40 side of the equation. So the permits help because it, you know, to the extent that we do get the data, and this data is to be coming to DHCD and Maryland Department of Planning, and we will analyze that. But we won't really have any authority to do much about it, but it'll at least give us a metric around what are the processes, how are they working. As I mentioned before, I was a developer in one of my past lives. One of the development projects that I was involved in Maryland, I was looking at a 4-year process, and then I wasn't even sure if there was going to be, you know, light at the end of the tunnel for what would have been a very sustainable development project in an infill site. You know, why? So why are we making it harder to develop in places we want people to develop in? So understanding these permitting processes will help. It's a part of the equation. I think it is part of multiple pieces we need to understand and do better with on that development side of the equation. The other question, next slide, that you had asked, well, I just wanted to throw in there that the Housing Expansion and Affordability Act, also passed last session, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, is another part of that because it really incentivizes through density bonuses and other mechanisms to ensure that we make use of that investment we've made around transit areas, that we optimize land once again around those areas so we get the best possible value out of all of the investments that we're making and have that optimization, if at all possible, where we can. Next slide. So I want to also mention, in terms of these threats to land preservation, they've come up from the other secretaries. I believe that growth and development does not have to be a threat. What we have to do is help to frame it, to create the sustainable growth model and this framework and this better understanding. Just like LEED for buildings, if you're familiar with that, gave developers a better idea and method of measuring and scoring what is a green building. We will, through this process we're embarking on, be able to better define what is sustainable growth, what does it look like, and have a tool through a guidance document for not only other agencies, the local jurisdictions and developers to be able to point to and say, okay, we understand what you want, we understand what you're trying to do, and here's how we're going to be measured. I think the residential growth, in some respects, I think some of what we see with monolithic residential growth is often because there's no alternative. It's all that is being provided. To the extent that we can work with local jurisdictions, provide best practices, provide examples of case studies and model ordinances of how to get back to this goal of thriving communities and what does that look like, I think we can do better there, because that is also creating a threat on land preservation. And then the big one that's out there that no one's mentioned yet that we're raising the flag on because we've tasked with this is every 5-year saltwater intrusion. Just as we're trying to preserve land, we have to regenerate and also be mindful of the fact that right now we have rising sea levels, we have resiliency issues. The report that we're going to be issuing basically points to the fact that we're also losing land, not only because of growth, because of natural forces around us also. Next slide. So the other question that was posed to us was around the state income tax credit conservation easement donation. We've actually talked with our other sister agencies around this. Obviously, in this particular budget environment we're in, we don't necessarily support that. But what I do support is what we're doing, which is creating better alignment, better efficiency with what we have. Taking a look at what we already have on the books. How do we make them work better? How do we use them better? How do we align across the agencies? For instance, around this sustainable growth framework that we're building out in partnership with other agencies. Because I think that there are other ways to get to the end result that we're looking for. You know, as I mentioned, and I'll say this again, to the extent that we can make it easier to create a path towards what is a thriving community and what is community, then I think we can really target and guide development practices in a direction that works for everybody, and at the same time meet some of our 40 by 40 goals. I'm very interested in multiplier benefits. So to the extent we are making investments, are we getting maximum benefit from every investment? Are we ensure we've checked all the boxes of have we done all we can do with every dollar that's invested in every program that we're running? I think that's my last slide. Hopefully that gives you a sense of where we're at, how it touches on, Maryland, the Beautiful Plan actions. So obviously that was just launched. We are charged through our Sustainable Growth Subcabinet with the updates to this. And so the first year update was quite a short year since it has just been launched. And we'll look forward to tracking that with our partner agencies at DNR and Maryland Department of Agriculture and others in terms of the next 5-year cycle should give us more information about, and I would like to be able to fold into that by then, this new sustainable growth framework is another method of beginning to create a dashboard or metrics around how are we growing sustainably across Maryland so that we can in fact have both. I think that might be the final slide. Yes. Okay. Questions?
If I may jump in, hopefully you guys can hear me.
Yes, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Secretary Flora, for your overview. A lot of good, inspiring stuff happening and great opportunities ahead of us if we get sustainable development right. I wanted to follow up a bit on your discussion about sustainable development, optimizing opportunities for housing development to accommodate the population growth we're anticipating in the next 30 years. So maybe I'll focus on a specific example. I won't name it, I'll just refer to it. I'm aware of a transit-oriented development housing project that's been proposed in Maryland. And this particular project I got to visit in person, and it proposes to convert some unused land to productive use. There's an old mall / shopping center that's basically abandoned in proximity to a transit stop. And this particular site could be really attractive for new housing. There's been some ups and downs and a concerted opposition has been mounted against this proposed housing project. And it seems like, and I'm still learning all the details, but that question of zoning has come up in a way that's contrary to the housing expansion bill we passed. So again, speaking very generically, because I'm still learning about all the details, but with your focus on sustainable growth in mind, I'm wondering how you might suggest we approach great opportunities for transit-oriented development, housing expansion in a sustainable manner when there's pushback, like this particular project is seeing.
Yeah, that is a great example and great question. It kind of digs deep into my community development roots. You know, yes, zoning is local, first of all. But I do think, and I am a believer in the carrot method. And I do believe it gets back to this idea of, you know, what is a thriving community? What does it take? What does it look like? I think we need more visualization. We need to undo people's perceptions of what housing was and what it, you know, what they sort of believe is going to happen. There's a lot of fear. I think people, you know, have an image of what new housing development might look like and who might live there. And we have to debunk some of that. And I think some of that, sometimes that is in visualization, community building exercises. It's sort of understanding what a thriving community and who's at the table. A lot of times the folks that are the loudest voice in these situations aren't necessarily representative of the larger community. And so, you know, those are just sort of some of the array of issues, I guess, and opportunities that I've seen in a variety of situations where there is an opportunity to make something better. But the question becomes, how do you define better and by who? And it gets back to good old charrette practices and start at the beginning of bringing everybody together and visualizing, because I do think the other thing we've done, and I will accept responsibility of this as a planner to a degree. I've never worked in the planning and the zoning side of things, but we've made it too complicated. Zoning ordinances have become impossible to interpret unless you hire an attorney. We've layered on complexities. I am an advocate of trying to do, like I said, more with visualization, help people understand, well, what works for you visually, and get less bogged down in all of the, I guess, the zoning narrative that makes it impossible to get anything done. And we can't change that at the state level in terms of local code. But what I feel we can do, and what my agency is doing as we are trying to sort of redefine even our agency as planning at the state level, is best practices. I've always found that to the extent that we can really elevate and showcase good practices and good examples and provide those model ordinances and provide examples, it helps some people overcome the fear factor and overcome perception of what was isn't necessarily what is and what can be. And we have to move people in that direction. So I would love to have more conversation on you because it's in my sweet spot, but it is not unusual to see.
Yeah, and I think this is going to continue to come up as we try to support local jurisdictions in rolling out, you know, compliant housing TOD developments going forward. But thank you so much. We'll talk again. Thank you.
Yeah, and Delegate Lewis, I would just add, this is why these sustainable growth principles, I think, are going to be such an important tool for us, because from a carrot incentive resource standpoint, even future comprehensive planning, if we can align around, well, this is what we need. And if you are moving us there, then we all agree and we'll get behind you. But right now, we don't really have that, not in a good form that's usable. Other questions?
Senator Brooks, please jump in.
Sorry,
Yes.
my internet's not
Okay,
stable.
but thanks,
I'll follow up
Madam
later. Thank you.
Secretary, for your presentation. On one of the panels, you're talking about the TOD, the transit-oriented development, and I think that's an ideal way to help the supply, the housing supply crisis. On the affordability side, I think those are oftentimes the TODs are the new units. and the very people who that could possibly help, it would probably become cost prohibitive, even though if you were to live near, live in at a TOD, of course, you're going to reduce your transportation costs, which is good, getting some of those expenses down. But oftentimes, the people who can afford to purchase a TOD are the ones who could also afford a car, and just the opposite for the folks on the lower end of the economic scale. So how do we perhaps try to mesh that?
Yeah. Well, as you're well aware, the TOD and the Housing Affordability Act was just one piece of the puzzle. There has to be multiple pieces. And within that, there is a requirement that a certain amount of affordable housing units be included in that context. I think that, the other part of this is infill. It's rehab of existing housing. It's, we have to sort of look at, are we getting the best level of density? Accessory dwelling units. I led a task force on that this past year. Are we making best use of the land and making it possible for people to do this? Now, I can't tell what local zoning officials should do or local communities, but I can try to help make it easier for them in terms of these best practices and model ordinances and showcasing those examples. I think that TOD, any TOD example, though, to the extent that there's been a serious public investment in an area to make it more accessible and to be able to create higher and better access for all, then we have to look at the affordability side of that equation. And I think to some degree we have. At the same time, having been in the developer world, the pro forma has to work. And it's hard, especially when you start dealing with, all of the common spaces, amenities, all of the pricing and everything that goes with this. So the more that we create complex regulatory processes and long periods of time, that adds to the cost of doing development. And so to the extent that we can look at all aspects of what the cost of doing development and bring those costs down, there's certain things we can't. Labor and materials are what they are. They've escalated significantly. But there are other ways to do that. And I would say through, to the extent that a project is something that checks all the boxes, does everything we want, can we move it through the system easier? Can we find ways to sort of make it something that we kind of look at that pro forma and work with the developer and the community to do that? I've been in those roles and I know it's possible, but we have so many different jurisdictions and different areas that somehow at the state level, we have to lead, I think, by showing these good examples.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Secretary. I see no further questions for you. Greatly appreciate the thoughtfulness of your approach to this. It's not an easy thread to whatever the analogy is. You know what I'm saying? Okay.
Well, it's been 30 years in the making, so it's not going to happen overnight, but we're on a path.
Needle to thread. There you go. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And lastly, we'll hear from the Maryland Food System Resiliency Council on the new map that was just put together, and we are joined by Nancy Gunn, the co-chair, who comes to us from the Harry R. Hughes Center for Agroecology, and Mike Hinson, other co-chair, who is Maryland's Chief Resilience Officer.
All right, y'all hear me okay?
You're a little low, Mike.
Uh-oh, any better now?
That is better. Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right, excellent. Well, if I can just make one quick correction, I am not co-chair. It's actually Secretary Strickland. I'm just sitting in for Secretary Strickland today, as he's unfortunately not able to make it. So he sends his regards. But thank you all for giving us the time to speak with you all today. Given that we're a little crunched for time, I'm going to cut down on my initial opening a little bit to make sure that we have time for my co-presenter to really get into the meat of what we were asked to present on today. So with that, next slide. As mentioned, I am Mike Hinton, the Chief Resilience Officer for the state, and I lead the Maryland Office of Resilience here at the Maryland Department of Emergency Management. So that's me, and I'll pass it to my co-presenter for her to introduce herself.
And I'm Nancy Nunn. I'm the co-chair of the Food Resiliency Council and the Assistant Director of the Hughes Center for Agroecology.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nancy. Next slide. So just a quick overview of what we're going to cover today. We'll have a real quick look at the Maryland Office of Resilience, and then we'll move into kind of how that ties into the Food System Resiliency Council, or FSRC, as we'll refer to it often, and then get more into the council recommendation around food insecurity mapping. Next slide. And next slide again. So here you'll see on this slide just some of the key points from the legislation that created the office. You can peruse that if you like, but I'd just like to kind of give a little bit more context and background on the office. So the General Assembly established the Maryland Office of Resilience within the Department of Emergency Management in 2022. The office's intent is to coordinate the state's resilience efforts by establishing a statewide resilience strategy and working closely with state and local partners to identify and fill resilience capability gaps. If I could just take a second right here, I'd be remiss if I didn't just acknowledge Chairwoman Elfreth for co-sponsoring that legislation with Senator Katie Fry-Hester. And also want to call out, like I just said, we work closely with the state partners, and the three secretaries who preceded me today have all been not only welcoming to myself and our office, but also supportive and engaged in all of our efforts. So thank you to them as well. So getting back to our office and the FSRC, in the wake of the COVID pandemic, the General Assembly also established the Food System Resiliency Council in 2021, assigning it to the Department of Emergency Management for both staffing and to permanently co-chair the group. The FSRC was established as an advisory body to make recommendations on improving the resilience of the food system from farm to fork. The council is made up of a diverse group of representatives from state and local government, nonprofit and advocacy groups, private sector, including farmers, and academia, including Extension Service. With the creation of the Office of Resilience, the FSRC recommended to formally move the advisory body under the office, and the General Assembly made that change to legislation in 2024. Secretary Strickland continues to co-chair the body, and the Maryland Office of Resilience provides staff for the group. And with that, I will pass it over to my co-presenter and a very excellent partner in helping with this group, and wonderful to work with from our office's perspective. So Nancy, take it away.
So thank you, Mike. I could say the same thing. I think we are very fortunate to have the Food Council nested within the Office of Emergency Management. They have been great partners throughout this whole process. We can go to the next slide, please. So as Mike said, this is and we're going to do an overview very quickly of the Food System Resiliency Council. Next slide. As Mike said, it's a 32-member advisory board. The one area I really like about the Food Council is it represents every aspect of the food system. So if we can go to the next slide, you'll see there are, well, this is our vision, is to shape a resilient, sustainable, collaborative, and equitable food system for all communities. And I think if you look at our vision, our mission, and our core values, all of three of the secretaries that addressed you today are speaking about similar efforts. We're looking at creating thriving Maryland communities, ensuring that there's equity in everything that we do at the state, and also trying to do collaborative efforts to make the best uses of our resources and provide resilience for our citizens. Next slide. So as Mike said, we are made up of state legislators, 2 state legislators, Delegate Warwick Charkoudian and Senator Fry-Hester, state agencies, extension services, and stakeholder organizations. And on the next slide, you'll also see there are people that are food producers, farmers, food system policy, nutritionists. It really is varied. In addition to our work as a state food council, we are also working to help local food councils be formed throughout the state. And that has been a very interesting process. They're each varied according to their regional area. So next, please. Our council goals to address the food insecurity crisis, develop equity and sustainable policy recommendations, expand the impact of the existing food council organizations, which I just spoke about. And we do have a number of starting organizations, I would say, throughout the state, and develop a strategic plan to increase the production and procurement of Maryland certified food. And number 4 is one that we work very closely with the Maryland Department of Agriculture, as well as the producers and other state agencies such as the Maryland Department of Education and the state institutions on increasing the Maryland Certified program. Next. We have 3 committees, communication and coordination, and throughout the legislative session, this committee is tasked with following the work of the legislative session very, very closely. And we actually provide a Monday afternoon session for anyone interested in food work and the general public to follow the various bills that are being introduced and legislation related to the subjects. Distribution and access looks closely at how is food available in communities and how do our community members access it? And is there access for everyone? And then environment and production is looking at environmental concerns as well as the production of the food in the state. Next, please. So this will lead us to our final, the council recommendation on food insecurity mapping. Next. Each year throughout the council's existence, we have recommended the establishment and maintenance of a statewide food insecurity map. And we're really trying to look holistically at how we can address the concern of food insecurity throughout the state and where the gaps are and how we can also address that through non-government services, government services, as well as providing our farming community an opportunity to address some of the gaps. Legislation is not required for this recommendation, but funding would be required for this recommendation. Next. And these are some of the categories that we think are really important to have within this mapping. The census data, poverty data, SNAP programs, all of the federally funded programs, school-based nutrition programs, existing food assistance providers. Next. As well as where the hunger spots are, where our local growers, certified growers are, where the farmers markets are, the distribution centers, and where the critical infrastructure is. Right at this point, and I'm sure you have all heard similar conversations, had similar conversations with your constituents. Everyone knows a piece of this, but there isn't one central repository for it. And that's what we're hoping to create, a central repository where someone looking for food, someone that is interested in selling to a school or selling to a farmer's market will be able to find all of this information in one spot. Next, please. So that's really a short and sweet overview of both the Food System Council, but also what we see as one of our primary focuses is working together and being able to create this resource that we think would be useful in many of the other conversations that we heard today regarding thriving communities, regarding planning for communities, as well as the agriculture community's needs. So thank you for allowing us to talk with you today.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'll just step in on Senator Alfred's behalf quickly to say thank you, Mr. Henson, Ms. Friedel, for your overview. This is exciting and fascinating. I don't think I remember hearing about the Office of Food Resilience before. I'm glad you exist. Love to see you have the resources you need, which brings me to my question. The food insecurity map could be a powerful tool for planning and understanding and communicating. You mentioned that although a bill isn't needed, funding is. Is there a plan to make a request for that funding, or do you anticipate making this happen? And how could we potentially help?
So the recommendation, which is within our, the Food System Resiliency Council's annual report, 2024 report, did indicate that we'd like to make a request, or there should be a request somewhere in the amount of $300,000. That would be for a 2-year period, just one single request for $300,000. But it would allow us the opportunity to have a GPS certified professional and have the framework to be able to gather the information from all the existing maps and set up the system that we would want to have set up for this map. After the 2-year period, I mean, we've asked for a 2-year period, but after that, you know, we're hoping that we can figure out how it would be structured. At this point, there's so much duplication with various nonprofits, with various state agencies, that we're looking at how that monies might be pooled to continue servicing that project.
Gotcha. Thank you for clarifying. Back to you, Senator, if you need to.
I don't have any questions or see any questions from senators.
Any questions from delegates? We're usually a chatty bunch. I don't think I see any hands. All right. I think that brings us to the end of our formal agenda, Senator.
Right on time. Yes, good work, everyone.
Wonderful. Shall I go ahead and close this out?
Please.
Wonderful. So as this is Senator Alfred's last official meeting of Program Open Space in her current role, I'd just like to take one more opportunity to thank her for her leadership. You'll be missed, but we'll all be cheering for you as you represent Maryland in the U.S. Congress. Thanks for all you've done. Big shoes to fill. I want to thank everyone else who's joined us today, all of our secretaries and all of our agency staff. Thank you to our state senators and state delegates for being here. Thanks so much to the Program Open Space staff who make sure that we get this meeting scheduled and up and running. Thanks so much to Andrew and Derek. I want to, before I close, just say there was some really good news reported today, worth flagging. Again, I think one of those accomplishments is the fact that Maryland has reached surpassed $1 billion state investment in agricultural land preservation, over 300,000 acres preserved, and more to come with DNR. And that was a report from the Department of Agriculture. Great news. The Department of Natural Resources, also really good news, and also invitation to do more. But the Bay Water Agreement, really important landmark agreement, and the fact that we've got $8 billion of outdoor recreation happening now is incredible and a testament to leadership and commitment over time. I personally, and I know a lot of folks are really excited about the newest state partnership park in Baltimore City, the Gwynns Falls Lake Park, coming online. Thank you, DNR, for your work on that. Planning, always lots of interesting and inspiring news. We look forward to working with you to roll out an effective sustainable development plan. And then lastly, the Office of Food Resilience. So glad you guys exist. I hope that you're also tracking food deserts and grocery stores, because we always need more information on those and how to facilitate their development and survival. And we'll certainly do all we can to support your search for $300,000 to build that food insecurity map, which is so needed. With that, I'll thank you all again. We'll be meeting in the new year. Stay tuned for those details. And once again, thank you. The Joint Subcommittee on Program Open Space is adjourned.
Thank you all.